Imagine you're reading a story. You know a murder has been committed. You know there's a detective. You know, somewhere in those pages, the killer has already revealed themselves, every clue planted in plain sight. The game is fair. The rules are clear. Now imagine finishing the story and realizing you never stood a chance. Not because the author cheated, but because something in the human brain, the very same brain that Sherlock Holmes was designed to expose, kept getting in its own way. In 1892, Arthur Conan Doyle published The Adventure of the Speckled Band. A woman dies in a locked room. Her last words are a riddle. Her twin sister comes to Baker Street terrified she'll be next. By the end, Sherlock Holmes has solved it, and the solution is so elegant, so completely supported by the clues on the page, that readers feel a specific sensation. Not quite satisfaction. Something sharper. The feeling of having been outthought. Millions of readers have read that story. Almost none solved it at first. Why? What is it about the way Conan Doyle constructed those pages that made the answer simultaneously obvious and invisible? That's what we're exploring today. Not just the Speckled Band as a story, but what it tells us about perception, deduction, and the strange psychology of the perfect detective story. What makes a mystery fair? What makes a detective feel real? And what does the Sherlock Holmes method actually reveal about the limits of the human mind? Because to understand why Holmes was so extraordinary, we first have to understand why the rest of us are so ordinary. The world and the people. To understand Arthur Conan Doyle and the world he built, you need to picture late Victorian Britain, which is to say, a society obsessed with order at a time when order felt genuinely threatened. Britain in the 1890s was the center of a global empire, the richest nation on earth, and also a place gripped by quiet anxiety. Cities were growing faster than anyone could manage. Crime felt like it was everywhere. The newspapers were full of unsolved cases, sensational murders, miscarriages of justice. The police, Scotland Yard, in London, were respected but regularly embarrassed. Jack the Ripper had made that clear just 4 years earlier in 1888, 5 murders in the East End, the most infamous unsolved case in British history. No arrest. No explanation. The public's confidence in formal investigation was shaken. Into that gap stepped Sherlock Holmes. Arthur Conan Doyle was a doctor by training and a writer by compulsion. Born in Edinburgh, Scotland, in 1859, he studied medicine at the University of Edinburgh, where one of his professors was a man named Joseph Bell. Bell was famous for something that most doctors only dreamed of. He could look at a patient who had just walked into the room and, before they'd said a word, deduce their occupation, their history, sometimes their name. He read bodies like texts. Conan Doyle watched him do it for years. Then he turned that method into a character. Sherlock Holmes first appeared in A Study in Scarlet in 1887. The response was moderate at first. Then the Strand magazine started publishing short stories in 1891, and Holmes became a phenomenon. Not just popular. Genuinely, historically famous. People wrote to Baker Street as if Holmes were real. Some still do. Conan Doyle himself had mixed feelings about this. He found Holmes exhausting. He wanted to write historical novels. In 1893, just 1 year after The Speckled Band, he would throw Holmes off a waterfall. The public reaction was so extreme, black armbands in the streets of London, that he eventually brought him back. Conan Doyle was trapped by his own creation. There's something almost poetic about that. Holmes is worth examining as a psychological construction, not just a fictional hero. He was designed to embody a very specific idea, that the world is legible. That if you look carefully enough, clearly enough, without emotional interference, reality will tell you exactly what happened. He doesn't feel things the way other characters do. He doesn't form attachments easily. When Dr. Watson, his companion, his audience surrogate, the man whose slightly slower mind allows readers to keep pace, when Watson meets him for the first time, Holmes has been conducting an experiment on the floor of a hospital laboratory and he immediately deduces Watson's military service from the way he holds his arm. Watson is stunned. Holmes is bored. That contrast is the engine of the entire series. Watson represents the reader, intelligent, experienced, but constantly surprised. Holmes represents something aspirational, the version of observation we wish we were capable of. His not a fantasy of power or violence. His a fantasy of clarity. The Adventure of the Speckled Band was published in February 1892 in the Strand magazine. Conan Doyle later called it his favorite Holmes story. A poll of readers in 1927 ranked it first out of 60 Holmes tales. It has been adapted for stage, radio, television, and film more times than anyone has properly counted. The setup is this. A young woman named Helen Stoner arrives at Baker Street in the early morning, frightened and exhausted. Her twin sister Julia died 2 years earlier in a locked room. Her last words gasped in the darkness, "The Speckled Band." No one knew what she meant. The official verdict was a heart attack. Helen now occupies that same room, at the insistence of her stepfather, Dr. Grimsby Roylott, and she has started hearing the same sounds Julia heard before she died. A low whistle in the night. The clang of metal. Holmes listens. Then he says something that should feel impossible, "I believe I know what happened." He's never visited the house. He hasn't examined the room. He has, at this point, 3 pieces of information: a dead woman, a locked door, and 2 sounds in the dark. And somehow, that's enough. The crime. Stoke Moran, the family estate in rural Surrey, a county south of London, is a crumbling manor house. Dr. Roylott, the stepfather, is a man of violent temper and unusual habits. He keeps exotic animals on the grounds, a cheetah, a baboon. He is physically enormous. He once bent a fireplace poker with his bare hands to intimidate Holmes, which is a memorable scene partly because Holmes quietly bent it straight again after Roylott left. The layout of the house matters enormously. Julia Stoner's room, now Helen's room, has 3 features that will become the entire case. First, a bell pull, the kind of cord you'd tug to summon a servant, hanging beside the bed. Second, a ventilator, a small shaft cut through the wall connecting to Roylott's adjoining room. Third, a bed bolted to the floor so it cannot be moved. When Holmes sees these details, his expression changes. Each of these things is wrong. The bell pull doesn't connect to anything, it hangs free of the bell mechanism. The ventilator doesn't open to outside air, it opens to another bedroom. And a bed bolted to the floor has only one purpose: to ensure the person sleeping in it always sleeps in the same position, in the same spot, directly below a specific point on the ceiling. The clues are all there. They have been there from the first page. Conan Doyle gives the reader every piece of information Holmes has. The Speckled Band is a swamp adder, a fictional but plausible venomous snake. Roylott trained it to travel through the ventilator, down the bell pull, and bite whoever was sleeping in the bed below. Then he would recall it with a whistle and return it to his safe. The snake left no wound a Victorian doctor would recognize as a bite. It left no footprint. It passed through a locked door because it never touched the door. This is the fair play principle at its most elegant. Every clue is technically visible. The milk saucer in Roylott's room. The presence of exotic animals on the estate. The safe with no visible purpose. The ventilator that opens to the wrong place. The bell pull that does nothing. Holmes doesn't receive secret information. He looks at what is already there and refuses to see only what's convenient. Holmes and Watson stake out of the room after dark. They sit in silence, in the dark, for hours. They are waiting for something Holmes knows is coming but hasn't fully explained to Watson. Then the whistle. Then the rustling in the ventilator. Holmes strikes at it with his cane. The snake retreats through the vent. Roylott, waiting in his room, receives what he sent. He is found dead in his chair, the speckled band coiled around his head. Pause here. If you were reading this story for the first time and hadn't been told the solution, at what point would you have suspected the snake? The saucer of milk? The ventilator? Be honest with yourself. Most people, even on rereads, say the same thing. The clues feel obvious only once you know the answer. That sensation has a name. We'll get to it shortly. But first, how did Holmes see what no one else did? And what does the answer tell us about how all of us actually think? The investigation. When Helen Stoner first arrives at Baker Street, the obvious suspect is obvious. Dr. Roylott is violent, financially motivated, he controls her inheritance, and deeply strange. Holmes agrees he's suspicious. He does not assume he's guilty of the specific crime. This is the first reversal. Every detective story trains you to fixate on the most alarming person in the room. Holmes refuses to. Roylott is alarming. That's noted. But alarm is not evidence, and the method demands evidence. Early investigators, the official coroner, the local authorities, had concluded natural causes. Heart failure. No signs of poison they could identify, no wounds they could explain. The locked room was taken as proof of innocence rather than a puzzle requiring a solution. They had asked how could someone have done this, and answered they couldn't. Holmes asks, given that something clearly was done, how? That reframing. That simple inversion of the question. It changes everything. Holmes's method gets a name in the stories, deduction. He sometimes calls it the science of deduction. But philosophers and psychologists who've studied the stories carefully tend to argue that the word is slightly wrong. What Holmes mostly doesn't deduction in the technical sense, it's abduction. Or, more precisely, inference to the best explanation. Deduction is, if all A are B, and this is A, then this is B. It's airtight, formal, logical. What Holmes does is different. He looks at a set of clues and asks, what single explanation would make all of these facts make sense simultaneously? Not what's possible. What's necessary? The bed that can't move, the rope that doesn't ring, the vent to the wrong room, these aren't individually suspicious. Together, they point at one explanation so completely that almost nothing else fits. The philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce described this process in the 1880s, roughly when Holmes was being invented. Peirce called it abductive reasoning. Conan Doyle almost certainly didn't read Peirce. But his Dr. Detective embodies the principle exactly. Here's what's strange about the Speckled Band case. The clues aren't hidden. Conan Doyle doesn't lie to the reader. He doesn't withhold information. Every object Holmes notices, the reader can notice. And yet almost no one reading the story cold solves it before the reveal. Psychologists who study this phenomenon call it hindsight bias. Once you know an answer, it feels obvious. The knowledge of the outcome restructures your memory of the information that preceded it. You genuinely believe you would have figured it out. Studies show people rate their pre-knowledge confidence higher than it actually was, consistently, in case after case. But there's a second effect too. Readers, like investigators, are subject to what psychologist Daniel Kahneman described as System 1 thinking: fast, pattern matching, efficient. The brain doesn't laboriously catalog every detail in a room. It builds a rough model and fills in the gaps. Roylott is threatening, therefore Roylott is the danger. The locked room is the puzzle, therefore the door is the answer. The saucer of milk, the rope that doesn't ring, these fall below the threshold of conscious attention because they don't fit the model the brain has already constructed. Holmes defeats System 1 by operating almost entirely in System 2, slow, methodical, suspicious of pattern. He treats his own first impressions as suspects, not conclusions. There's a formal concept in Golden Age mystery criticism called fair play. It was codified in 1929 by Ronald Knox, a British priest and writer, in what he called the Decalogue, 10 Rules for Detective Fiction. Rule 1. The criminal must appear in the story early. Rule 2. No supernatural solutions. Rule 5. No undiscovered poisons or scientific devices may be used without explanation. The Speckled Band predates Knox's rules by nearly 4 decades. But it follows nearly all of them instinctively. The snake is a real animal. Its method is explicable. Every clue is in the text. Roylott is introduced early. No hidden twins, no secret passages that aren't hinted at. What makes the story feel like a locked room mystery, when technically the room isn't sealed against a snake traveling through a vent, is exactly the point. Holmes doesn't just solve the crime. He dissolves the apparent impossibility. The locked room was never a real puzzle. The real puzzle was the assumption that the room being locked mattered. At this point in the investigation, if you were on the jury of this story, what evidence would you point to? The milk saucer? The ventilator? The animals in the grounds? Comment below. What clue would have convinced you? But solving the crime is only half of what this story does. The rest is even stranger. More personal. And it reveals something about why Sherlock Holmes became, and remains, one of the most famous fictional characters in history. Psychological breakdown. Dr. Roylott is not a complicated villain. He's drawn in broad strokes: violent, greedy, isolated. Conan Doyle doesn't spend many words on his inner life. But his psychology is coherent in a specific way that rewards attention. He's a man who had power, social status, professional standing, wealth, and lost most of it through his own behavior. He killed his butler in India. He did time in an Indian jail. He came back to England diminished and bitter, dependent on his stepdaughter's inheritance. The exotic animals, the deliberate menace, the bent pokers, these are performances of a dominance he no longer actually possesses. The murder method itself reflects this. It's clever but baroque. A trained snake. A specially modified room. A plan that relies on the victim sleeping in exactly one spot. It's the kind of plan that appeals to someone who has convinced himself he's smarter than everyone around him, which is precisely the kind of thinking that is most likely to leave clues. Helen Stoner is underwritten by modern standards. She exists primarily as the client, the person who brings the case to Holmes. But what Conan Doyle does capture, almost accidentally, is the psychology of someone in a coercive relationship with a family member they both fear and depend on. She doesn't go to the police. She goes to a private detective she's reading about. She arrives in disguise. She's terrified of what Roylott will do if he finds out. When Holmes receives her and names her stepfather as the probable killer, she doesn't immediately say yes, of course. She hesitates. This is one of the most psychologically honest moments in the story. The person who is most at risk is often the last to name their danger clearly. Conan Doyle perhaps didn't fully understand why he wrote it that way. The pattern is real regardless. Here is the reframing insight at the heart of this entire video. Sherlock Holmes is not admired because he is realistic. Surveys of forensic psychologists, criminologists, and detectives consistently find that real investigation looks almost nothing like a Holmes story. Real cases are slow, ambiguous, full of bad data, false confessions, faulty memories, and evidence that points in three directions at once. Real detectives don't arrive at scenes and immediately identify the killer from a scratch on the floor. Holmes is admired because he represents something we want to believe is possible, that reality is legible. That paying close enough attention is sufficient. That if you are careful and rational and free of emotional bias, the world will reveal its secrets. This is a profound fantasy. And it's worth examining why we need it. Victorian Britain needed it because disorder felt everywhere and the formal systems for managing that disorder, police, courts, medicine, kept visibly failing. We still need it, arguably more than ever, in a world where information is everywhere and certainty feels scarce. Holmes is not just a character. He's a psychological comfort object for the epistemically anxious. He says, understanding is possible. Truth is findable. Attention is enough. Victorian critics were somewhat puzzled by the Holmes phenomenon. They understood it as entertainment, as escapism. They didn't fully understand it as a psychological proposition. Later critics went further. Dorothy Sayers, herself one of the great Golden Age mystery writers, argued that the detective story was the one genuinely moral form of popular fiction. It posited that crimes have solutions, that guilt is detectable, that justice is achievable. This, she thought, was why the form was so compelling during periods of social anxiety. There's a counterargument. If detective fiction tells us that dedicated attention always wins, does it also create unrealistic expectations of what real investigation looks like? Does it make juries expect Perry Mason confessions? Does it make the public impatient with ambiguous verdicts? This is what some legal scholars now call the CSI effect, jurors expecting forensic certainty that real science can't always deliver. Conan Doyle may have contributed to that, a century before television made it ubiquitous. The stories that comfort us sometimes shape us in ways we don't fully notice. That tension doesn't go away when you close the book. Resolution and aftermath. The Adventure of the Speckled Band was first published in February 1892. It has never been out of print. It has been adapted more than 30 times for stage, radio, television, and film across at least a dozen countries. Conan Doyle himself adapted it for the stage in 1910, the live snake being impractical. He used a different solution in the theatrical version, then had to admit publicly he thought the original was better. The story has been analyzed, dissected, and occasionally challenged. Some readers note that a real swamp adder doesn't exist. Conan Doyle invented the species. Some note that snakes don't actually follow training the way the story implies. As scientific criticism goes, this is fair. As narrative criticism goes, it misses the point entirely. The story works because it does what the best mystery fiction does. It creates an experience of being outthought, then immediately invites you to understand why. You weren't stupid. You were human. Your brain behaved exactly as it was designed to. Holmes is extraordinary because ordinary brains are, in fact, ordinary, which means the gap between the detective and the reader isn't insulting. It's informative. The Sherlock Holmes stories didn't just entertain. They established a template that almost every detective story written since has either followed or consciously reacted against. The fair play tradition, explicit rules requiring authors to give readers all necessary information before the reveal, grew directly from the Holmes model. Knox's 1929 Decalogue, Agatha Christie's Refinements, the Detection Club in London, founded 1930, where Christie, Sayers, and others swore an oath to play fair with readers. All of this traces a direct line back to Baker Street. Holmes also changed how real investigators thought about themselves. The FBI's early criminal profiling work in the 1970s explicitly cited Holmes as an influence. Forensic science became partly aspirational because of the stories, the idea that physical evidence could be read like language, that crime scenes were texts, arrived in popular consciousness through Conan Doyle before it arrived in police procedure. Whether this is entirely a good thing is, genuinely, complicated. The stories promoted evidence-based investigation. They also promoted the idea of the exceptional individual genius as the key to justice, which real criminal justice systems cannot and do not run on. Here is a question Conan Doyle never answered, and couldn't have. If Holmes's method is a fantasy of perfect attention and perfect logic, why does it feel so true? Partly because the method is grounded in something real. Joseph Bell, the Edinburgh professor, actually did what Holmes does, more or less. His diagnostic reasoning was systematic and empirical. The fantasy is the speed, the certainty, the absence of error, not the underlying process. And partly because the feeling the stories produce, the sense of course, how did I not see that? Is a real psychological experience. We do periodically achieve that clarity. A problem resolves. A pattern snaps into focus. The world is briefly, unexpectedly legible. Holmes is an exaggeration of a real cognitive state, not an invention. That might be the most interesting thing about him. His not a wish for a power we don't have. His a wish for a version of ourselves we occasionally, fleetingly, almost are. The game is afoot. 3 words that have outlasted their author's intentions, their original context, their own meaning. Not because Holmes solved every case. Because he believed, and made us briefly believe, that every case could be solved. The question is whether that faith is an engine or a blindfold. Probably, if you're honest, it's both.